Welcome to our Bible study in the book of Revelation. We are continuing our study in chapter 13 this evening, and we'll read that entire chapter. But as we get started, just keep in mind that a lot of times how we have read Revelation is one that uses a lens of interpretation rooted in fear. But really, for the group of people who would have been listening, hearing these words, it was not intended to be a work that promoted fear, that they had to sort of look around them and wonder what's going to happen and cower in fear, but rather these words were intended to be hope filled kinds of words, that they were to encourage the communities that were experiencing difficulty and oppression and lived in fear at times. So it was actually intended to reorient them to how to live in the world, to sort of tear back the curtain so that they could see reality as it really is, and not how it is often painted to be by those in power. And so we'll continue in this story and recognizing that chapter 13 has a lot of imagery and some numbers that are utilized, and there's all sorts of interpretations that have been used that could be confusing. And so I hope to bring a little bit of light to that this evening. Let's read chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast its power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth, and it had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. And also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, as we begin in this initial chapter, or this chapter 13, it again begins in a very strange space. John has this sort of vision of 3 different beasts or animals or creatures. The first one is a dragon, and you can think of sort of a serpent-like dragon, perhaps not the dragons that we would typically think of in most movies now, but more like a serpent. And so connected with that serpentine imagery of the Garden of Eden, Satan coming to Adam and Eve and tempting or testing humanity in the garden. That imagery that has often been reinterpreted to be about Satan, the accuser, and all that kind of stuff, is here utilized as the one who seems to have all the power. That there's this sort of dragon looming in the background, almost like a marionette, player playing the marionette dolls on the world stage. And out of that are two beasts that come crashing onto the scene. One comes out of the sea, and the other comes out of the earth. The sea is representative not only of, for instance, Rome's great power on the Mediterranean, but it's an imagery of chaos, of primordial, crazy chaos that is disruptive and often devastating to life. It's a place of evil, of spirits, and what seems to be really darkened about the world. And so the seas are a very dangerous place. And so this beast that emerges or erupts out of the ocean, out of the sea, out of these chaotic waters, is representative of something. It's not just a creature, but this creature symbolizes something. We get a sense of that with the 10 horns and the 7 heads, which has some imagery that's rooted in prior stuff like Tiamat, who was one of the gods in Babylon. We'll hear Babylon come up a little bit later, but Tiamat was the goddess of chaos, that all of the world was sort of formed out of when she was killed. But she was this really just evil, chaotic kind of god. So you get the sense that whoever or whatever this beast is representing, there's a sense of foreboding chaos that is represented by this beast. Now, the 10 horns, 7 heads are 10 crowns on its horns, and horns being a symbol of power, and each of these heads has a blasphemous name. It's suggested by quite a few commentators that these are representative of the rulers, the monarchs, the Caesars of Rome, and the 7 hills of Rome. And so this is a beast that seems to have some connection with Rome. And we'll get a little bit more into that, especially at the end. But the commentators are suggesting that what is coming out of these chaotic waters is the empire of Rome. It's rooted in all sorts of sort of mysticism or mythology, but Rome is taking on this sort of mythological creature in John's vision. And the beast itself serves the dragon. So the empire is a servant to that which is destructive and evil and wrong with the world. In other words, the dragon, Satan, that kind of thing. So there's already this sense of sort of opposition. What's really intriguing is that this particular beast also is given great power, has a throne, authority, and it seems like one of the heads of the beast has taken a fatal wound. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but this fatal wound will be important for understanding maybe the identity of who 666 represents. But something about this wound has been fatal. That same word for the wound has been wounded or fatally wounded is also the same word that is utilized for the slain lamb that is introduced in chapter 5. So there's some sort of parallel here, a comparison, if you will, of the slain lamb that the saints and the angels are proclaiming as the one who is worthy to open the scroll that God has, versus this beast that serves in some parallel fashion the designs of the dragon. What's interesting is the whole world is filled with wonder and follows the beast. What could possibly make you feel wonder at this kind of beast that seems to be full of destruction and chaos? Well, if you think about the Roman Empire, its great, abilities with architecture and its great military power and its economics where it was at the sort of pinnacle of the world stage in a great portion of the world. And so it wielded a lot of power. It was feared by many. You get this sense of awe, even today, if you were to go and visit some of these great sites of temples and palaces and all that kind of stuff, you get a sense of just how awe-inspiring it is. So to say that it's chaotic and destructive, that's true, but there is a certain appeal to it, especially for those who benefit from it. And the world is filled with wonder and follows the beast. People worship the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worship the beast and ask, who is like this beast? Who can wage war against it? And that was a continuing question in those days as Rome continued to exert its power even further down through the Mediterranean, even down through to Egypt and places like that. So that is a kind of overall question. This beast seems to be so dominant. Not only is the beast dominant, but the beast is given a mouth that utters proud words and blasphemy, and it's arrogant and exercises its authority for 3.5 years. Now, this isn't intended to necessarily be an exact timeline. 3.5 years means it has a time that it seems like it's a long time, but at some point there is an end date. Its time isn't forever. It goes on for a time period, but there is a concluding reality to this. So its days are numbered, you might say. It's opened its mouth to blaspheme God, to slander God's name, and also God's dwelling place and those who live in heaven. The Roman emperors often tried to set up their images in the temple or in the holy places, and several of them were worshipped as gods, as deities. And so that certainly seems to be consistent. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. That certainly seems true of Rome. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. A little bit of an exaggeration, but it did exercise a large bit of power and territory. And all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. So again, we have that kind of comparison between the Lamb and the beast. The Lamb, who is the giver of life, versus the beast, who is the bringer of chaos. And then there's this little poem: if anyone goes into captivity they will go. And this is a call for listening and hearing. In other words, do this. If anyone goes into captivity they will go. If anyone's killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. So John pauses this picture of this first beast and reminds God's people how they are to engage this beast that slaughters, that kills, that maims, that is destructive. Do not resist evil with evil, but repay evil with good. This is sort of John's love theology at work here. Do not pick up sword against sword, but rather endure evil with patient endurance and faithfulness. This is a reminder of the call of the gospel. And so then John resumes his story, his vision, talking about a second beast that comes out of the earth. And it has 2 horns like a lamb. So again, this sort of comparison with Jesus, but it spoke like a dragon. So it obviously works for the powers and principalities of the world. It works for Satan. And so it exercises all authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. So the function of the second beast is actually to promote and encourage worship. These are the priests of the day. These are the supporters of the Roman Empire through worship, both emperor worship, but worship as a whole. In other words, what the priestly function of these people is in Roman society is to help move people from questioning Roman power to worshiping it. And this is certainly a function of most societies, especially totalitarian societies and societies that exercise power in destructive kinds of ways and have risen to a level of power where they don't want it to be questioned, especially by those who are underneath. So you organize their desire to worship what the society is about. They are to be good Roman citizens. It's Rome first. It's, let's make Rome great again. All those kinds of things. And so there's a reality of worship that is at play by these priestly beast, the second kind of beast. It performs great signs, and it even causes fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of people. You could think of the story of Elijah and how Elijah called down fire. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in the honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. We're not sure exactly what is intended by this. Was that a wound that actually killed, or just harmed where it was on the seemingly on the brink of death? We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. And so there's no room for any sort of discussion otherwise. If you don't follow this God, if you don't follow this nation, your life is at stake, and even quite literally to be killed. This is the kind of level of worship that the beast promotes about the Roman Empire and its Caesars, its kings. And it also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads. Now, this goes back to Deuteronomy 6, where it talks about what it means for God's people entering into the land. They are to mark their heads or their foreheads or their forearms or their hands with the Torah, to be reminded that what they do with their hands or what they do with their minds, what they are doing with their totality of their lives, the Torah, the instruction God had given God's people, was to always be at the forefront of their minds and practice with their hands. And so this is sort of an undoing of that, or a reorientation of that towards a different kind of mark, no longer marked by Torah, by God's instruction or God's law, but rather this mark, the word mark there is a word that is used for the sort of stamp for official public documents, or the stamp that was put on coins with Caesar's image. And so here again, we have this language of empire. So what we have been marked by, what these people have been marked by, is the imagery of empire, the imagery of domination and power, and the utilization of power for the life of Roman Empire, and Caesar. So if people don't have this mark, they're unable to buy, they're unable to be part of society, they're cast out, they're pushed out, they're killed. What's intriguing about all of this is, in a lot of commentary for how this should be interpreted, I hear a lot of things like, oh, they're going to get a chip in you, and then they're going to be able to track you and make you do whatever you want to do. That's not what's at issue here. By the way, if you carry a cell phone or a credit card, you already have a chip that you carry around everywhere. So you already utilize those kinds of things. They could track you if they wanted to. But that's not the issue. The issue is what we have been marked by, what our lives are reflecting in our thought life, in our practices. Do they reflect the way of the beast, of death, of destruction and chaos, of a way that is counter to the way of the crucified lamb, the way of Jesus? Or does our life reflect the way of Jesus, a way of self-sacrifice, a way of cruciformity, of taking on the cross and bearing that cross and not retaliating through violence and power, but rather seeking the way of life and blessing and peace? And so this imagery of the mark, it has more to do with character than it does with a microchip being put in somebody's hand. Now, verse 18 is where it sort of comes to a head here. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. And that number is 666. Now, 666 is, again, has been translated in a lot of different ways. Essentially, if you were to take those numbers and translate them into Hebrew, or in some manuscripts, the number's a little different. It's 616, and it's correlating to a Latin translation. So either one of those, you get the name of Nero Caesar. So Nero was one of the emperors in the late 60s AD of Rome. He was extremely violent. He often persecuted Christians. He committed suicide in 68. He killed himself in 68. But there was a legend that began to grow shortly after that, after he was buried. People weren't entirely sure that he was dead. Maybe he ran away, maybe he hid himself, maybe he was just waiting to come back on the scene. And so there's this legend that begins to grow around Nero that he was not in fact dead, though he appeared to be. He was in fact alive and was going to come back when things had changed or settled down, and he would bring back his power. There were several people along after Nero that tried to claim they were Nero. Most significant was probably in 88 or 89 AD. There was a person that actually convinced the Parthians that he was Nero and that he had come back to take his power, and the Parthians marched with him on Rome to fight them. But beyond that, 666, Nero is a type, a personality type, or a figure for a particular kind of life, a life of destruction. And so in the time that John's writing this, the Caesar Domitian is actually the current ruler of Rome. And he may have been even worse than Nero was in terms of his treatment of others, especially Christians, used a lot of violence, was just a heinous person. And so in some ways, he is a sort of reincarnation of Nero. He is the re-embodiment of Nero and his particular politics, which is simply to say sometimes history does not die, or sometimes history repeats itself. So this idea of, this calls for wisdom, this number of the beast is the number of a man, it's the number 666, is not just simply about Nero himself. It's about the way that the dragon and the powers and principalities of this world can take individuals, it can take communities, and it can begin to shape them in their own image in ways of power and domination, of brokenness, of trampling over the poor and downtrodden. This is an image of the Roman Empire as a sort of not just looking on the outside, but beginning to look underneath the surface at the spirit of the Roman Empire and its leaders. And that what is coming out of that is this deathly reality. It's chaotic, it's broken. It even mimics the way of the Lamb, but it is not the way of the Lamb. It's very different than the way of the Lamb. It may seem to have some things that appear to be similar to what the crucified Lamb has. It has the horns like a lamb. It seems to be wounded like a lamb, but it is not the life-giving Lamb. It is not the life-giving way of the Lamb that has been slain since the foundations of the world. And so there is this false kind of religion that is tied to nationalism in this story, that where the people of God are sitting, they are called not to be deceived and to begin to put their place of hope in the nation or in the empire, but rather to be remembering they are a people of the crucified Lamb who has been raised to new life and is the one who is worthy and who is taking a different way of power in the world. Not a way of domination like a dragon that devours, but the way of the Lamb that is willing to be slain. And so there is a very different kind of telos, a very different kind of image of where we are headed as God's people, and a reminder not to be consumed, not to be drawn into worship of nations and powerful leaders, but to keep our eyes on the crucified Lamb, who is the very life and breath of God in the world. May God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you peace in these days. And may our prayer be, as we continue to head towards an election season, may it be that we would not place our hope in a false god. May our hope not be in a nation or its leaders, but rather our hearts, our practices, our mind would be shaped, be stamped by the image of a lamb that has served us, and so we serve one another. May God bless you and keep you.